Hey guys, and welcome to the next and final video for chapter 12, where we discuss the collapse of the two major powers of the classical world, and that's Han China and the Roman Empire. Now, keep in point, this is a favorite topic for the AP exam. They love asking questions about comparing and contrasting the fall of both of these, of Han China and Rome. So, kind of pay special attention to any similarities and things of that nature. All right, so first, talking about the Han Dynasty. A big problem that it had to deal with was internal political strife. Years and years of the ruling elites kind of jockeying for positions had led to factionalism. Factions are these little mini groups that are all fighting for power within a government. It led to a lot of literal backstabbing, murder of people and, this family trying to take another family out. And it just had the overall impact of destabilizing the central government. On top of that, the land reforms, remember of Wang Mang, the usurper, they were done. They really never came to fruition. And so the large landowners, they just start to gain more and more power. So what does this lead to? It leads to a lot of upset peasants. And this is going to lead to peasant rebellion. When you've got disease, like we talked about in the last video, these plagues that are spreading through, and you've got the large landowners taking up all the best land, the peasants are going to get very upset, and it's going to lead to rebellion, such as the Yellow Turban Uprising. We talked about that very briefly in the last chapter the chapter that we did previously on China, but it was a very, very large scale peasant uprising, which also had, it was led by, people of the elite as well that were just looking to take control. Eventually what this amounts to is that by the 3rd century CE, the Han government is done and it breaks apart. Another big problem that it had was that it was just very, very big. You look at the 3 kingdoms that emerged. 220 CE is generally regarded as the end of the Han Dynasty. And you have the 3 different kingdoms, the Wei, the Wu, and the Shu, that emerge afterwards. It was a big, bloated empire, with a big, bloated bureaucracy. And it just became very, very difficult to govern the whole thing. So the generals, in kind of jockeying for position, they kind of split it up themselves. And it formed these separate autonomous regions and remain that way for a number of years afterwards. It would be, and even after this, 3 kingdom era, it would be a while until they had another powerful centralized dynasty that would emerge. Also on top of that, both prior to and then right after the collapse of the Han Dynasty, you have nomadic invasions. Now, these were not widespread, invasions of war and things like that. They were really much more gradual invasions, but they were from the nomadic people to the north and started to work their way down. And the largest groups of these was the Xiongnu. Remember talking about them in the previous chapter. And while they were not considered to be ethnic Chinese, after they moved in, they adopted Chinese customs. They assimilated into Chinese society. They started dressing like the Chinese. They adopted the Chinese written script, and largely just kind of became a part of the overall Chinese society. Another very big impact that the collapse had was the decline of Confucianism. Confucianism was all about the stability of government, and that had failed the Han. The government was no longer stable. They wasn't really getting the job done anymore. And so they went back to a much more unstable, chaotic situation, and so they were turning more to religions that could offer them hopes of salvation. So Taoism and Buddhism, you really saw an increase in the amount of worshippers for both of those, while Confucianism would kind of fall to the wayside for a little bit. It would not become extinct. It would make a big comeback in later dynasties, but in the immediate years after the collapse of the Han Dynasty, Confucianism was not very popular. Okay, next, collapse of the Roman Empire. Now again, remember we're focusing on similarities, and there you go, internal political strife. This was really kind of encapsulated by the barracks emperors. Now, barracks are where the soldiers live. Excuse me. And it was called this because the emperors, they excuse me. Rome had never really been able to establish a strong dynastic lineage of imperial rule. It was basically whoever had the support of the soldiers at that time. And so you had, for a long period of time, emperors were chosen by the army or whoever had the support of the army. From one period of about 50 years, from 235 to 284 CE, you had 26 different emperors. Only one of them died of natural causes. Usually, they were assassinated or they were driven out or chased to their own death somewhere on the outskirts of the empire. So this was a very, very chaotic time. It's tough to really establish a strong centralized government when emperors are getting stabbed. Now, one guy who tried to kind of put an end to this was this guy Diocletian. And Diocletian had, it was his belief that the empire was too big. Remember we talked about in Han China, big, bloated empire and government. So Diocletian said, well, what if we split it? And so they divided the empire into a west and an east. And you notice that, well, two things about this. One, Diocletian did not live in Rome. In fact, none of these guys, we'll talk more about why there are four of them in a second, lived in Rome. Diocletian decided to live in the eastern part near this Greek trading city of Byzantium. But you notice there's also, so here you've got the co-emperor Maximian, but then you've got these two other guys, Galerius and Constantius I. They really formed like a four-man ruling group, and this became known as the Tetrarchs. So in essence, they were four emperors. You had an emperor, like an official emperor for each empire, Diocletian and Maximian, and then they had a co-emperor, kind of like a vice president, but was able to have similar type of authority. It worked to an extent, but at the same time, it made, the centralization very much a problem. It's like, well, who do we listen to? It's, if I'm on the West, all right, I'm not listening to Diocletian anymore, but am I listening to Maximian or am I listening to Constantius? So it just, it was still somewhat confusing. This changed with Constantine. Constantine was the son of one of Diocletian's top generals, and he was able to take over the throne after a long and bloody campaign, and he reunited the empire. Here you see a statue of Constantine. We already mentioned him, for he was very, very important in the legitimization of Christianity in issuing the Edict of Milan in 313. But the other big thing to remember about him was officially changing the capital of the empire. He says, I'm going to keep it in the east, and we're going to keep it in that city of Byzantium where Diocletian lived, but we're not going to call it Byzantium anymore. We're going to call it Constantinople, and he named it after himself. And you notice how the eastern was much more urban and metropolitan. Okay, this was where the money was. If you're dividing it down the middle, this was definitely the better part. This was the backwoods. This was all a bunch of, kind of the savages on the outskirts. And you see all these different groups, the Germanic tribes. We'll talk about them in a second. All right, so the military was significantly weakened. The Roman legions were not what they used to be. In fact, they actually had a very embarrassing, episode of a Roman emperor being captured by the Sassanid Empire and Valerian, and had to live out the rest of his days in captivity. And with this, they had a series of invasions. And the first one, even though it didn't directly lead to the fall of Rome, had a very, very destabilizing impact, and that was from the Huns. Now, the Huns were not one of those Germanic people. The Huns were actually Turkic-speaking people from Central Asia. They were largely nomadic, very, very good on horseback. Think of them as being kind of, one of these predecessors to the Mongols that we'll talk about later. And they start to spread out from Central Asia, and a large group of them, led by their warlord Attila, start making their way through today would be Russia and into Eastern and Central Europe. Now, the Huns had the effect of a domino, of the first domino, and they start pushing out all of these other Germanic groups. All of these groups didn't originate from Germany, but, the area north of the Roman Empire was kind of collectively known as Germania, and so it just became a term for them. All right, so the Huns start pushing their way through, and this kind of, as I said, has this domino effect of moving all of these different Germanic tribes all over the place because they're running from the Huns. And the Roman Empire didn't have the strength that it used to in order to protect its borders. So you get all of these different groups that starts coming through. You get the Vandals, you get the Visigoths, they're a very important one. You get the Ostrogoths and so forth. Angles and Saxons, we'll talk more about them in a later chapter on medieval Europe. And eventually, Rome is going to be vulnerable. And in 410, actually, the Visigoths, you see, they make their way they actually sacked Rome. That wasn't the official fall of Rome, but still it showed that Rome was on the way out. And they were basically abandoned by the Eastern Empire. And in 476, the Western Empire collapses when the Visigoth king, Ottavasser, he ousts Romulus Augustulus, the last emperor of the Western Empire. So 476 is considered to be the end of it, and that also ends our discussion on chapter 12.